Mighty Switch Force!
From the perspective of 2011, Mighty Switch Force was a game that got its job done nice and tidy. 16 levels worth of commanding a variety of blocks and enemies in a fun adaptation of Patricia Wagon's Constable Job, where strict protocols and field accidents shape you up in the mastery of a speedrunning playstyle that rewarded your steadiness and street smarts. Was there anything left to add about a game so concentrated in delivering that? Well, yeah, of course. Why settle for a passing grade when you can push your limits and overachieve, maybe even shoot for a promotion? A few months after its initial launch on 3DS, it received 5 bonus levels, and thus 5 more chances to expand on its most well-designed ideas. More hopping around, crazy block patterns, more maps made purely out of red and blue blocks, and more large-scale cannon highways with designated puzzle rooms at every corner. It even got to revisit the exclusive gimmick of its final level, where switching blocks manually was disabled and became automated by a timer. I really enjoyed this challenge in the original. It felt like the culmination of the organic precision and caution you've been practicing all game. Patty doesn't get a single upgrade throughout the adventure. When levels got more complex, her wits had to be sharper, and the last incident was the hardest and longest level in the game, adding insult to injury with a handicap to her most important ability, and a last-minute boss fight. It sounds like the worst closing shift to assign to a human being possible, and yet Patty was completely capable of overcoming this trial. Navigating puzzles no differently than any previous level, fighting the boss despite the stipulation, and even being built with the potential of a part-time achievement at the end. It was a victorious ending, Patty's greatest human achievement despite the odds, and another book-ending level like it is great to see. 5 new levels didn't dramatically change the package, but they were a nice gesture towards a game that was worth brainstorming where the core gameplay left off, especially generous at the time as a free DLC update. But the idea of expanding the first game didn't stop there. With every major home platform finally being in HD by 2012, Mighty Switch Force aimed for a console release, which paved the way for a multi-platform and PC release later on. Hyperdrive Edition brings the game to the realm of high resolutions, and so a subtle quality of life change here is a wider field of view compared to the original. Less cramped moments or off-screen guesses to make than the handheld version, but the biggest overhauls are its visual design and new content. Mighty Switch Force's marketed artwork is now the dominant art style of the in-game graphics, and the results are pretty clean. I do think the pairing of sleek comic book artwork and rich pixel art of the original was a more unique approach, like a homage to the glossy game covers and magazine ads of classic sprite-based titles, which is ultimately lost when you make the entire game have one consistent style. But on the other hand, there's plenty of new details that make the facelift worth the effort. Blocks are no longer floating placeholder graphics, but now actual blocks with bolts, creases, and waxier shines to them. Of course, the best glow-ups can be found in the new animations of the cast. Patty in particular has a more eye-catching design that lets her expressions and idols take the spotlight. You can even unlock Zero Suit Patty, something that was only teased in the ending and death animations of the original, which is great. Hey, if Patty's not wearing her helmet in this model, how is she flipping the blocks? Oh, I guess it's some sort of wireless signal thing in her brain. Wi-Fi? LAN? Whichever's the right one? Oh, it's cause she's a robot all along. Okay, well, here's hoping we get a factory model Patty as a playable someday. Reduced to a motherboard on death, maybe. And just when you think that 21 levels was enough, Hyperdrive Edition literally doubles down on that notion. New hyper versions of the original levels, and even the bonus levels have been added. A hard mode version of a level on paper may initially sound like adding a bunch of blocks or spikes as an arbitrary challenge and calling it a day. And yeah, while they do reuse the original maps, I was actually surprised by the amount of crafty curveballs that some of these levels expect you to pull off. Reminds me a lot of the trickier parts of the first run. It's really cool. Sometimes you'll be going an entirely different route or train of thought compared to the vanilla layout, and I respect that level of ingenuity when remixing the base game. creating challenge not through bulking up ideas that were already there, but by recognizing the limits of those ideas and the right places to push them. This also means that at its latest form, there are 4 levels featuring the automated switching gimmick. And isn't life really cool like that, when you get multiple chances to do your final level gimmick? Does anyone relate out there? Hyperdrive Edition's best investment, besides the pretty graphics and being playable on a TV and controller, is justifying that this gameplay style wasn't limited to one form, and that there's still a lot of creativity left to be mined out of this project. So why not take that a step further with a full-on sequel? 1 year after Hyperdrive Edition, Mighty Switch Force 2 releases and asks what would happen if Patty moved on to a much more demanding occupation in public safety. The answer is that she'd be even more of a dependable go-getter force in one of the freshest sequels I've ever played.
You're safe!
After playing street custodian and cleaning up the mess of a bunch of annoying criminals, Patty graduates into the role of a volunteer firefighter, and the shift in expectations is felt from the moment you start the first level. A spontaneous combustion unfolds and the entire city is engulfed in flames. Even the Hooligan sisters, who caused all the fuss from the first, are reformed but reluctantly find themselves as runaways yet again. Patty's overachieving attitude and professionalism from the first game find a better calling in 2. Once a girl happy with doing night shifts now becomes the lifeline of a code red emergency at any time or weather. Even managing to patch up her rocky relationship with the sisters from the past with a selfless dedication to protect them this time around.
No one's left behind!
The new additions to gameplay also reflect this growth in character. The fundamentals of 1 make a return, but now they're compounded with a ton of other responsibilities. Putting out flames, keeping your eye on combustible objects, dousing muddy blockages, knowing how to operate fixtures on the street. It's no longer enough to be as street smart as Mighty Switch Force 1 when everything about it is now on fire. It's hard not to argue that these are essentially chores and inconveniences slapped on top of the original gameplay, but my counter-argument is that chores and inconveniences are the bread and butter of this gameplay. 2's additions carry on the same speedrunning language that made the first game so compelling. Problems that appear to stop your progress, but ultimately always have a fast and smart solution. Fires and blockages can be easily doused by Patty's new weapon, an organic water hose, but said hose can't solve every problem by simply holding the button. It has limits of its own. It can't stretch across the entire screen and has to gradually build up and diminish pressure to function. So you're encouraged to not just soak the level like an all-in-one solution, but to learn how to tame your ability for the right purposes, knowing when to let it go at max and when to let it trickle for things below your waist level. A perfect complement to the block switching mechanic in that regard. Reflexively and now offensively, Patty is in complete control of the fluidity of her performance. The new enemies and objects also respond to how wise you are with this new tool. Pink blobs need an uninterrupted stream of water to burst, and must be faced in the right direction. Oven blocks can be cooled off, but can ignite when left unattended. Muddy blocks are a borderline prehistoric take on modern block switching that's pretty funny in retrospect. Instead of switching them out with high-tech methods, you have to manually erase them like a commoner, sometimes coping with their lack of physical permanency for certain puzzles. That said, not all of 2's chore-to-gameplay ideas translate very well. I can safely say that the wandering charcoal puzzles are the biggest pace breakers for me. They're the equivalent of the bomb puzzles in the first game, which weren't that exciting either, and while I can say they're a bit safer designed in comparison, it still doesn't make them terribly efficient or fun, like the rest of the game's ideas play out. Here you're just babysitting a pet in the distance, letting it do its thing before you can move on. This is where a gameplay chore literally does feel like a chore, unfortunately. That said, 2 has some of the tightest puzzles in the series yet, the highlight for me being the color-coded pipe network. works. Unlike most pipe puzzles in video games, where you gotta routinely move a bunch of tiles to reach an inevitable solution, there's a fun platforming twist to that idea here. The solution is already built into the level design, and it's just a matter of where you situate Patty and what configuration of blocks will make the outcome apparent. Speedrunning these puzzles when you know the exact way to lock things around is really satisfying. In fact, I'd argue that 2 has the more challenging part-time experience compared to the first, but also the more rewarding one. There was plenty of room to go with the flow and earn part-times in the first game, but the part-times of 2 take a bit of work with the amount of stuff that you're obligated to do. A master plan in your head before starting a run is almost always a necessity, which I personally really enjoy. I loved nailing the part-times in the more complex maps of 1, and that feeling applies to almost every incident in 2. I also check it out as a good summation of how much this sequel empowers its main character thematically. Despite adding more danger at every premise, despite the new rules you gotta follow, things that would make your character feel over-encumbered than their perkier origins, Patty never feels significantly nerfed. If anything, playing as her in 2 with the same tenacity that defined her best performances in the first makes her come across as even more confident and reliable, a full-grown hero in the making. The soundtrack also sticks out for this reason. The first game had a really great one, techno jams with melodies that highlight Patty's unconditional optimism for the job. And the second game follows that up with more drama and tension to the tracks, the kind of themes that underline the last remaining hope of humanity, but being self-aware enough to know that it's being carried by what is essentially a cheerleader in a volunteer position. Wonderful stuff all around. These are the kinds of growth spurts that I love to see in a good sequel. Mighty Switch Force 2 may not have gotten the same hyperdrive treatment as the first game, it's pretty much stuck with the same 16-level run as that entry originally had, but like that title in 2011, it's hard to get upset at the lack of bonus content when the content that is there is already so excellent and charming. So an update, a remake/remaster, and a dedicated sequel later, comes the inevitable wacky spin-off of the first game, 2015's Mighty Switch Force Academy. This was a bit of a weird one to process at first. I guess the best way to describe the stuff in Academy are sorta wish fulfillments of the first game. What if you could play Mighty Switch Force 1, but get to see the entire map on one screen? What if instead of collecting 5 girls, you had to collect 20 or something? What if sometimes blocks were huge? What if it had co-op and battle modes? What if pretty much everything about that original game was cranked up to their most cursed degree? I mean, it makes sense, considering this was a game backed by Steam Greenlight and community feedback at the time. And I'll give it this, having the entire map on display does sort of resolve one of the recurring issues of the previous games, the camera being a bit hokey and unreliable. Having everything on screen does make plotting your course, or knowing what's ahead, fundamentally more accessible, but that also has a big trade-off, which is that you lose the close-range focus of a normal camera zoom. It's easy to visualize the map now, but it's also just as easy to lose track of Patty and the moment-to-moment gameplay when you have to squint your eyes to do so. I mean, hey, at least you have some idea of what to put on when you rent out an entire movie theater for a video game or something, but I think even with a proper large display display at home, I couldn't reach a good comfy zone with Academy even by the time I finished it, a feeling I never encountered in the previous games. Here's the thing, because of this format, for better and for worse, Academy has some of the most difficult puzzles in the series. There are some interesting gimmicks here that could have only been possible by this setup. I also like that they revisit the teleporter gimmick from the final level of 2, and one idea that has you subtly switching between 3 planes of blocks rather than 2 was really cool when I put my finger on it. At best, the moments that it pulls what-if scenarios out of the first game's formula are amusing and often pretty natural extensions of those original beats. But at its worst, I'm left a bit frustrated, wishing that there wasn't such a drastic visibility thing going on with the game at large. Maybe this is a game that works better in a co-op setting, and overall it's hard to really call it an outright bad game. The same tight gameplay that defined the first game is still there. You just kind of have to magnify it a bit. And like I said, there are some exclusive ideas here that do make the experience worth a run. A round of zoomed out Mighty Switch Force ROM hack levels isn't the worst way to spend an afternoon, I guess. I just wish that I could enjoy it more than it actually turned out. But you know, one bizarre installment is not enough in my eyes to sully a game that at this point earned a charitable amount of support, enough to warrant this multi-platform collection in 2019. Available on pretty much everything as of writing. It's Mighty Switch Force on a console called the Switch, aren't we in the best timeline? It's always good to see a game escape from abandonment on a legacy platform and get a readily available port or remaster in the present. It's equally as valuable to be able to record a 3DS version of a game on a televised format, but Mighty Switch Force is one of those magical moments where a game was not only freed from an exclusive form, but also ended up investing really well into its future, leaving an impression in as many contemporary ways as it could. You could tell the team wasn't just milking the same level of content or creativity from the first. Every opportunity to expand was a chance to think outside the box and take more risks with those original ideas. If this collection was the last track record of Patricia Wagon, I'd say she had a well-deserved run, but if there was ever plans for a new Mighty Switch Force project, this collection would be the best evidence towards how far the ideas can go, and how reliably it can look and feel on just about any platform at this point. It's just like the gameplay and the setup. When push comes to shove, shove comes to burn, and any sort of danger arrives on any medium, you can always rely on Patty to save the day.